Thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today on my first visit here to Bakersfield. I've enjoyed your warm hospitality. And as we reflect on, I think a lot of things are on our minds, on our hearts, with what's going on in the world and in our country and in our church too these days. So I'd just like to offer some reflections on this. And as I was putting some thoughts together, my mind went back to a memory I had of several years ago. I had only been in San Francisco a couple of years, but it was a confirmation at a parish I went to. It still stands out in my memory. This was a large, working class Hispanic parish in our archdiocese. And I still remember being quite edified by two of the newly confirmed who, after communion, were sharing some reflections on what their confirmation meant to them. And they said that their confirmation gave them the grace to go forth and, as they put it, build a civilization of truth and love. I could not have said it better myself. Truth and love, these are really the foundations of civilization. Both are necessary, both together if we wish to have a flourishing society, both truth and love. Truth and love. Or truth in love. Truth in love. That, of course, is the title of Pope Benedict XVI's encyclical on Catholic social teaching. In it, he elaborates upon a theme which his predecessor, St. John Paul II, articulated in his social encyclical Centesimus Annus, regarding, as he put it, the need to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. This is what Pope Benedict says when he picks up on this. He says, in order to protect nature, it is not enough to intervene with economic incentives or deterrents. Not even an apposite education is sufficient. These are important steps, but the decisive issue is the overall moral tenor of society. If there is a lack of respect for the right to life and to a natural death, if human conception, gestation, and birth are made artificial, if human embryos are sacrificed to research, the conscience of society ends up losing the concept of human ecology, and along with it, that of environmental ecology. It is contradictory to insist that future generations respect the natural environment when our educational systems and laws do not help them to respect themselves. The book of nature is one and indivisible. It takes in not only the environment, but also life, sexuality, marriage, the family, social relations, in a word, integral human development. Our duties towards the environment are linked to our duties towards the human person, considered in himself and in relation to others. It would be wrong to uphold one set of duties while trampling on the other. Herein lies a grave contradiction in our mentality and practice today, one which demeans the person, disrupts the environment, and damages society. So he's making all of these connections, what he calls as human ecology. Everything is sort of part of an integral whole. Pope Francis, too, has built upon this insight of human ecology that his predecessors have bequeathed him. He certainly emphasizes it in his own social encyclical, Laudato Si', where he speaks all throughout on this interconnectedness of all of creation. The environment itself certainly makes this principle clear to us, right? Air and water do not know political boundaries. A polluted river in one country will be polluted in its neighboring country. Bad air quality in one city will affect the communities surrounding it, especially when they are downwind from their big neighbor. I knew that in Southern California growing up, south of that big city north of San Diego. But even more so, in all of the different sectors of life, all these different sectors of life are interconnected among themselves. So Pope Francis issued this encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si', Care for Our Common Home. But in doing so, because of this interconnectedness, he can be so bold as to say the following: learning to accept our body, to care for it, and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. Also, valuing one's own body and its femininity or masculinity is necessary if I'm going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different. In this way, we can joyfully accept the specific gifts of another man or woman, the work of God the Creator, and find mutual enrichment. It is not a healthy attitude which would seek to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. Indeed, this male-female complementarity, it is stamped in all of creation. We see that right at the beginning of the Bible, right? Genesis 1:27, male and female he created them. And a year before Laudato Si, an address to participants at the International Colloquium on the Complementarity between Man and Woman, sponsored by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the Vatican, Pope Francis said the following: "Marriage and the family are in crisis today. We now live in a culture of the temporary, in which more and more people reject marriage as a public obligation. This revolution of customs and morals has often waved the flag of freedom, but it has in reality brought spiritual and material devastation to countless human beings, especially the poorest and most vulnerable. It is ever more evident that the decline of the culture of marriage is associated with increased poverty and a host of other social ills that disproportionately affect women, children, and the elderly. It is always they who suffer the most in this crisis. The crisis of the family has produced a human ecological crisis. For social environments, like natural environments, need protection. Although humanity has come to understand the need to address the conditions that threaten our natural environment, we have been slow. We have been slow in our culture, even in our Catholic culture. We have been slow to recognize that even our social environments are at risk. It is therefore essential that we foster a new human ecology and make it move forward." So from sacred scripture, from the teachings of the recent popes, and indeed from observing all of creation, becomes clear that this complementarity between man and woman is at the heart of this, what the popes call the new human ecology. This is also conventional wisdom learned from millennia of human experience. As goes marriage, so goes the family, and as goes the family, so goes society. To properly order our society, we must begin, not end nor stop at, but we must begin by appreciating and esteeming the meaning of the complementarity of man and woman, and therefore foster the institution of marriage in society so that children may know and be loved by their mother and their father. This is a foundational good, not just for children, not just for the family, but for all of society. Marriage is the only institution that does this, that connects husbands and wives to each other and to any children who come from their union. Yes, Pope Francis is right, and we all readily recognize this. Marriage and the family are in crisis today. And this has, as he says, produced a human ecological crisis. To put it colloquially, it has messed everything up. The breakdown of marriage and the family has messed up everything in our society. And it actually has been going on for a very long time now. Very long time, even before the 60s, but it exploded with all of that social upheaval and the revolutions that took place in the 1960s. That phenomenon we know about the 60s was about a lot of things, some of which are values that we accept and cherish to this day, such as, and most notably, the decade in which the civil rights movement reached its zenith, culminating in the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it also generated a fragmentation of society that has continued to grow worse ever since and affects us acutely to this day. The infamous Summer of Love of 1967 was followed by a long winter of drug addiction, family disintegration, and despair. One very sad recollection of the aftermath of that Summer of Love, which had its epicenter in my town of San Francisco, it was shared by a woman who was still living in that part of the city in the Haight-Ashbury 20 years later. This is really sad, but this is what she said. They were expecting a city of love and found a city like any other, and a lot of them ended up being prostitutes. They had to support their drug addiction habit. Those years were marked by many ironies, which perplex me today. I'm still scratching my head. For example, yes, 1964 was an historical breakthrough for the civil rights of African Americans. But the following year, the Assistant Secretary of Labor and later multi-term senator from New York, those of you like myself more well-seasoned in life will remember him. He was a very well-known leader in the Congress, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a sociologist by training. In 1965, he issued his famous report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which is known shorthandedly as the Moynihan Report. He identifies and analyzes the deep roots of black poverty in the United States. What is his conclusion? That the high rate of fatherless families, 25% at the time in the African American community, that would greatly hinder progress of blacks toward economic and political equality. And there is no substitute for that. In fact, Moynihan, he was a Democrat, so he favored government programs to assist the poor. But he stated in the report, the steady expansion of this welfare program, as of public assistance programs in general, can be taken as a steady disintegration of the Negro family structure over the past generation in the United States. So there's the irony. You think the society would recognize this and do everything possible to reverse that trend in the African American community and to prevent it from growing and spreading to other sectors of society. Instead, what happened? Right at the moment that African Americans finally gained equality in the law, social conditions change such that behaviors which contribute to and exacerbate this problem became accepted and even expected, thus keeping too many black families trapped in poverty. And it affects black Americans more than any other sector of the society. What many saw as a racially charged issue in 1964 has spread throughout American society and across ethnic groups. In 2015, 39% of births to white non-Hispanic mothers were outside of marriage, as were 53% of births to Hispanic mothers and 70% of births to black mothers. If we add divorce rates into this mix, we can see that the fraying of our family ties has touched virtually every community in America. And the ironies continue. Again, some of you more well-seasoned here may remember, as I, that famous Murphy Brown line of then Vice President Dan Quayle. This is where, in a speech in 1992 to the Commonwealth Club, again of all places in my home city of San Francisco, he took a swipe at the popular TV character. That's just one in an episode where she was expecting a child and not married. So he took a swipe at her, saying, criticizing her and saying that she was mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice. This, of course, caused a huge storm of controversy, and he took a lot of heat for it. And yet, a year later, an article was published in the Atlantic magazine. This is the April 1993 edition, authored by Barbara Defoe Whitehead with the bold title, do you remember this bold title? Dan Quayle was right. All the heat he took, all that controversy was so mocked and so made fun of. This bold, Dan Quayle was right. So just to give you a gist of the content of this article, the praise under the heading stated the following. The social science evidence is in. Though it may benefit the adults involved, the dissolution of intact two-parent families is harmful to large numbers of children. Moreover, the author argues, family diversity in the form of increasing numbers of single-parent and step-parent families does not strengthen the social fabric, but rather dramatically weakens and undermines society. And you know, even Candace Bergen herself, who played Murphy Brown, said in an article published by the Associated Press 10 years later, she said, his, Vice President Quayle's, speech was a perfectly intelligent speech about fathers not being dispensable, and nobody agreed with that more than I did. Leaves you shrugging your shoulders, huh? So that article by Defoe Whitehead, it was just one small drop in a very large bucket of social science data collected ever since the Moynihan Report, confirming his analysis, linking so many grave social ills such as poverty, crime, incarceration, school dropout rates, youth violence, connecting all of that with family breakdown, and especially fatherless families. As just one example, a few years ago, the book Do Fathers Matter was published with the subtitle, What Science is Telling Us About the Parent We've Overlooked. In it, the author Paul Rayburn points out, there is no example of a human society in which fathers do not help raise the children, and that for most of human history, fathers were responsible for protecting their children and for teaching them the things they needed to know to survive and prosper. He explores many of the new experiments that have been completed on animals that appear to shed light on the unique contribution of fathers on their children. A study from David Popenoe at Rutgers University, cited in the book, cites that the evidence is overwhelming that a family of mother and father is better for the child than one parent. We need 50 years of social science data to tell us what we already know by common sense, but it's there for those who need it. And in fact, Senator Moynihan himself, in an interview with PBS much later in 2001, he said, with words that sound like almost a tone of fatalistic resignation, the following: my view is we had stumbled onto a major social change in the circumstances of postmodern society. It was not long ago in this past century that an anthropologist working in London postulated what he called the first rule of anthropology, that in all known societies, all male children have an acknowledged male parent. That's what we found out everywhere. And well, maybe it's not true anymore. Human societies change. All of this, I believe, is emblematic of a sort of a societal schizophrenia that has marked our nation and spreading to much of the rest of the world too, regarding the basic idea of marriage and the family. We bemoan so many social ills, especially poverty, which we know from broad, deep, and consistent scientific data, not to mention common sense, as I mentioned, is caused in large part by fatherlessness, while at the same time celebrating and enshrining in the popular culture a distorted notion of freedom with corresponding behaviors that destroy the integrity of marriage and the family, the very thing necessary to cure and prevent those social ills in the first place. This is precisely the purpose of marriage, or as I mentioned this last night, for those of you who have my interaction with the young people, as I said there, someone more studied on this subject than I put it this way: when a baby is born, the mother is sure to be somewhere nearby. But there's no guarantee that the father will be nearby. So society needs a cultural mechanism that attaches fathers to their children and to the woman with whom they brought those children into the world. And that cultural mechanism is marriage. It's the only one there is. There simply isn't any other. It is not a Catholic thing, then, to say that a child needs a father as well as a mother in order to have the optimal environment for their own flourishing. On the contrary, it is a universal principle that societies that don't manage the procreative implications of the sexual act don't last for very long. So that's the bad news, okay? But compare all of this to Pope Francis's opening words in his post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. Now there's that one little section that's controversial, but listen to these opening words. The joy of love experienced by families is also the joy of the church. What is most noteworthy here is that he does not begin with the experiences and challenges of families today. That is dealt with in the second chapter. The Holy Father begins by asking how God envisions the family. Only then does he examine contemporary experience and move on to a specifically Christian understanding of marriage and family life. This sort of topics is extremely important because it forthrightly affirms our conviction that there is a divine plan for marriage and the family. The joy of love, that is really what is at the root of all of the irony and confusion and social schizophrenia to which I referred a moment ago. It is simply the meaning of that word, love. That word certainly evokes complex realities, and it is necessary to exercise careful discernment. We might say of that watchword of the 60s, free love, what G.K. Chesterton said about birth control. It is neither. If by free love we mean intimacy without commitment, then it is certainly not love, except the poisonous self-love that uses another person's for one's own gratification. Nor is it, in fact, free. Rather, its price has been extremely high, both for society and for countless individuals. There is another sense, though, in which free love can be profoundly real and deeply Catholic. It is the freedom manifested in God, who created everything in order to share his divine goodness, and who made us in his image and likeness to enter into a communion of life and love with him. Communion and life and love sharing a bell. That's one of the definitions of marriage. It's that intimacy that God seeks with us. It is the freedom of unconditional divine love that sustains us in existence. The love of a Heavenly Father who sends his rain on the just and the unjust alike. It is the freedom manifested in Jesus Christ, who showed the depth of his love by freely laying down his life on the cross. Free love that is self-giving and sacrificial is divine. And it is that kind of love that is at the heart of God's divine plan for marriage and family. And that is what leads to sanctity, sacrifice, sacrum facere, to give away freely out of love, sanctifies us. That love put into action is what we call charity. On this point, Pope Benedict, in his encyclical, God is Love, Deus Caritas Est, says, charity cannot be used as a means of engaging in what is nowadays considered proselytism. Love is free. It is not practiced as a way of achieving other ends. Love is free. So there you have it. Even Pope Benedict is encouraging us to engage in free love. Yes. But free love understood in the Catholic sense, right? Free love is nothing other than God's plan for our human flourishing, and we are called to imitate that, to be perfect as God is perfect. That is the truth of what love is. But how can we speak the truth in love to our world? This is certainly a big challenge for us. This is simply another way of asking, how can we evangelize? An insight by Pope St. Paul VI offers us sound guidance. In his apostolic exhortation on evangelization, Evangelii Nuntiandi, he writes, "It is appropriate to emphasize the following point. For the Church, the first means of evangelization is the witness of an authentically Christian life, given over to God in a communion that nothing should destroy, and at the same time given to one's neighbor with limitless zeal. As we said recently to a group of lay people, modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. St. Peter expressed this well when he held up the example of a reverent and chaste life that wins over even without a word, those who refuse to obey the word." That's in 1 Peter 3:1. He goes on. "It is therefore primarily by her conduct and by her life that the Church will evangelize the world. In other words, by her living witness of fidelity to the Lord Jesus Christ. The witness of poverty and detachment, of freedom in the face of the powers of this world, in short, the witness of sanctity. The witness of sanctity. That is our most persuasive argument. The first believers lived in a society whose moral values stood in stark contrast to the truly free love of Christian discipleship. We can feel an affinity with them. They were often dismissed with the sneer smacking of an air of superiority, or worse, they were imprisoned or put to death because their way of life was an affront to those around them. But even those who despised, even though they despised them, they also admired them. In the 3rd century, Tertullian averred that even our enemies paid us this compliment. This great apologist described how Christian communities used their resources. This is what he said: "Not for banquets or for drinking parties, but for the support and burial of the poor, for children who are without parents and means of subsistence, for aged men who are confined to the house, likewise for shipwrecked sailors, and for any in the mines, on islands, or in prisons. Provided only it be for the sake of fellowship with God, they become entitled to loving and protective care for their confession. The practice of such a special love brands us in the eyes of some. See, they say, how they love one another. See how ready they are to die for each other." That's 3rd century apologist Tertullian. So this is a legacy we have received from our ancestors in faith. Those first generations of Christians in the city of Rome, they were often scapegoated by the powerful pagan Roman government. But when a plague would strike the city and the well-to-do would flee to the hills for safety until the plague subsided, it was the Christians who stayed behind to care for the sick and at great risk to their own health and their very lives. And not just the Christian sick, all the sick, regardless of religion, of how they lived their lives, or even what they thought of the Christians themselves. The historian Eusebius noted about the Christians of his time: "All day long, some of them tended to the dying and to their burial, countless numbers with no one to care for them. Others gathered together from all parts of the city, a multitude of those withered from famine, and distributed bread to them all. Likewise, the Emperor Julian complained to one of his pagan priests, they support not only their poor, but ours as well." So that's the witness of the sanctity of life. This is what the saints offer us: not a brief summer of love, but a perpetual springtime of love that is constantly refreshed by divine love. This is where the lasting joy of love is to be found. It is this kind of love and compassion in the service of truth, especially the truth of the human person, that has marked the lives of the holy ones who are our predecessors in the faith. Hospitals, orphanages, schools, outreach to the poor and the destitute, giving without concern for getting anything in return, and seeing in each human being, especially in the poor and the destitute, a priceless child beloved by God, one of these least ones, as Jesus says, whom God calls to turn away from sin and toward him so that they might be saved. So we need to persevere in bearing witness to the sanctity of life, both institutionally, with all the good the church continues to do throughout the world, that might not be mainstream media that notices it, but people assisted by our healthcare institutions, our schools, our Catholic Charities outreach to the poor, they experience it and they know it. And we need to live that in our personal lives, in personal encounters, that people can see beyond the stereotypes and the scapegoating to someone who is genuinely compassionate and caring. So it's a great legacy we have received, and it does seem that our society is getting further and further away from these truths. And getting further away not only from truth, but also love. They're supposed to go together. We seem to be getting away from both. Senseless violence, harsh rhetoric, bitter polarization, People now respond to those who disagree with them, not with counter-arguments and seeking to understand the other side, but by targeting their opponents, isolating them, and then attacking them. Verbally, morally in the sense of people who lose their jobs, are stymied in their careers, or the object of slander, and sometimes even physical violence. We see the continual demise of marriage, family, and now even the very idea of the human family consisting of male and female complementarity. We are aghast at the recent legislation passed in the state of New York, which is nothing short of infanticide, and horrified at the glee and jubilation with which it is celebrated. So, if we look on the dark side, and there's a lot of darkness to look at, the situation seems dire. But that is not the whole story. There is also good news to report. There is all the good the church is doing, but there's more. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about this, okay? Because it's true, I don't think it's ever been this bad in recent history, and our country is at a critical juncture. But there are silver linings in the dark clouds. First of all, there's the reaction to the New York legislation. You know, even people sympathetic to keeping abortion legal are disturbed at the elation displayed over the legal killing of newborn and near newborn human life. They sense there's something really wrong with that, even though they might be kind of squishy on abortion per se. They know there's something wrong with that. The aggressive pro-abortion forces detect a possible challenge now to their sacred cow, the Roe versus Wade decision, and they are reacting with unmitigated hysteria. That jubilation over that horrendous law passed in New York. Just look at their reactions to the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Absolutely hysterical. So they are finally showing their true face, a face that is vile, wretched, and evil. And those with eyes to see and a brain to think can trace it back to its origin, the evil and devastation wrought by the so-called sexual revolution. So their true colors are finally beginning to be seen. And even before this, though, a change in the conversation about pro-life at the beginning of life was already taking place. Now, those of you who are longtime veterans of the pro-life movement know what I'm talking about. In the early years of our movement, you were told that abortion was inevitable, and that, well, yes, there are some people who still don't like it. In a few years, it will be calmly accepted by all Americans as just a part of life. You were told that you were interfering with a woman's right to privacy, that church and state should stay out of the way. But you knew that that was just a deception technique to deflect attention away from the rights of that baby growing in her womb. And you were smart enough not to be fooled. Most of all, you were told that you were anti-woman, that you were standing in the way of women's progress and full equality in society. Now, 50 years and 60 million abortions later, the very painful truth has come to light. Yes, abortion does hurt women. Those of you well seasoned in the pro-life movement have understood that the movement is about, and has always been about, more than saving the life of the baby, as great and worthy as that is by itself. But it is also about the mother and providing her the emotional, spiritual, and material support she needs to make a truly happy and truly human choice. Indeed, so that she can truly even have a choice at all. You will recall that in the early years of our movement, these things I've just been talking about now could not be spoken about in polite company. To be known as pro-life, or even to defend the pro-life position when the topic would come up in conversation, would often mean banishment from the ranks of those deemed socially acceptable. But that has now changed. Yes, it is still harder in our society to be pro-life than an abortion rights advocate, but it's not so politically incorrect anymore to be known as a pro-lifer. Now one can be known as holding that position and still be respected in so-called polite society. This is actually progress. And even more so, we have the numbers to prove it. hundreds of thousands every year at the March for Life in Washington, D.C., and upwards of 50,000 at the Walk for Life West Coast in my own city of San Francisco. The Mass at our cathedral before the walk is the most attended Mass of the year in our Archdiocese, standing room only in our very large cathedral. I would imagine many of you participate in it, so you have seen all of that for yourselves. And you have seen, too, that the pro-life movement is young. It is largely young people at the Mass and at the walk, as well as at the March in D.C. I am the pro-life generation, they hold the signs. The young generation is the most pro-life generation since the disastrous Roe decision. And another data point to ponder. Last year marked the 50th anniversary of St. Paul VI's landmark encyclical on the responsible regulation of birth, Humanae Vitae. Again, those of you more advanced in life remember the fallout, the almost universal dissent, even among bishops, vicious attacks against Pope Paul. Those few who agreed with the teaching were running for cover. Compare that to last year, the 50th anniversary. Dozens of special conferences and symposia were held in our country alone to mark the anniversary. I attended and spoke at some of them myself. One of the first was held at the Catholic University of America, which had been the epicenter of the dissent, led by one of its professors of moral theology, Father Charles Kern. The irony was not lost on the university's president, John Garvey, who spoke about it quite explicitly in his opening comments, and expressed how proud and happy he was that the university was taking the lead in reasserting the truth of the Church's teaching. All of this would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. And on the Church's teaching on responsible parenthood, also there, it is young people who are embracing this truth, those with the eyes to see. Everywhere I go, people express to me their concern about the Church losing our young people. And it is true that the culture is eating them up, but not all of them. The Church is blessed with a core of vibrant, faithful young Catholics who are truly alive with the faith. They are affectionately referred to as the John Paul II generation. He inspired a whole generation. Pope Benedict continued to build on that. They came of age during their pontificates. They want the full truth of the Catholic faith, not the watered-down version. They yearn for Catholic worship that is reverent, beautiful, and God-centered, bringing out the best in our liturgical, artistic, and cultural patrimony. They understand the incredible, awesome legacy we have inherited as Catholics, our Catholic birthright, as I've heard some of them put it. And they want to build on it and pass it on to the next generation. This generation of young Catholics gives us assurance that the faith will be passed on to future generations, that the light of civilization, of truth and love, will continue to shine in the increasing darkness that seems to be enveloping our world in our time. This civilization is the legacy we have received from our ancestors in the faith, from those whose lives bore witness to love and compassion in the service of truth, and that we are now called to continue. Now is our turn, and in our time, this means especially defending and promoting the foundational good of marriage. Marriage, after all, is supposed to help a society learn the real lesson of free love, learning the lesson to be selfless, living for the other, not oneself. As St. John Paul II said so famously in his own encyclical on marriage and the family, Familiaris Consortio, and I alluded to this earlier, the future of the world and of the Church pass through the family. That is to say, the way of civilization passes through marriage, but so does our work of evangelization. Better yet, the work of evangelization is precisely the work of building a truly human civilization. That is, one based on the truth of the human person and of God's plan for our flourishing both as individuals and as a society, and indeed for our eternal salvation. Marriage is absolutely indispensable to this project in every way. It was through monogamous, lifelong, faithful marriage that the Church was able to Christianize a pagan world and call it to a higher and more noble, that is to say, truly human civilization. The spiritual and social rubble left in the wake of the upheavals of the 1960s is a call to us to attend to the work of rebuilding. But let us be careful and take note of Psalm 127. Unless the Lord build a house, they labor in vain who build. Unless the Lord guard the city, in vain does the guard keep watch. The work of civilization building, or kingdom building to put it in more common parlance, is really the Lord's doing, not ours. If it were ours, then we could change it. It would give us control over the project. Thus we would be not unlike the ancient Israelites who made a molten calf and worshipped the work of their own hands. Just as they felt the tug constantly back to paganism and making alliances with their pagan neighbors rather than be faithful to the alliance, the covenant their God made with them, God called them out of that paganism. They always felt that tug back. We too feel the tug of a sort of neo-paganism in our own time. So we need to make sure that we have this right from the start. God does the building. We are just his day laborers. Now, I know I've gone over time, but I'm coming toward the end here. The end is the answer. The answer is love. Free love, properly understood. But love in the truth, and the truth doesn't change. Laws might change, but truth doesn't. If the law does not correspond to our nature, such that there is a conflict between the law and nature, guess which one will prevail? And so it is no surprise that we have a lot to fix in our society. A society of justice, peace, and prosperity for all. These are the fruits of a society with a strong culture of marriage and the family, one that respects the sanctity of human life in all of its stages and all of its conditions in life. And it all fits together in God's neatly designed plan. It is really a package deal. We can't pick out one or the other that we like and discard what we don't. This noble cause is a call to love that we cannot abandon, that we will not give up on. And we know in the end, it's God's truth, so it will triumph. We are all alarmed at how extreme the situation has become, but as I pointed out, we do have much to be grateful for and to work with and to build upon. There are signs of progress. There is light in the midst of darkness. So let us steel ourselves with the help of God's grace to bear witness to the truth in love. For the truth spoken in love has a power over the human heart. The truth lived in love has even a greater power over the human heart, the power of attraction. Let us then pick up the torch and pass on to a new generation the beauty of God's truth, especially by living that reality in a way that makes a difference in our lives and in the lives of those around us, friend and foe alike, the witness of sanctity of life. Let us take heart from the legacy we have received. Let us place our trust in God, and let us go forth to be God's workers in building a civilization of truth and love. Thank you.